Okay, this is the implementation and overview lab for the Soul Matters theme for March 2020, and the theme is wisdom. I'll do an overview for about 15 minutes, and then as we have folks join us, and with Sam and Karina, we'll do some of the challenges and the opportunities and takeaways. So the theme of wisdom. As I said in the introduction, I had the good fortune to be able to go to Athens I was a bike wrench for a bike tour. And we were in a place that you could just walk right up to the Acropolis. You could see it from the top of the roof of the hotel, and you could walk right up there. And having been a philosophy major way back in undergrad for part of the time, I just loved being there and imagining Socrates walking through this place. And then I was doing the research for wisdom, I discovered that Athena is the goddess of wisdom, and she is often pictured holding an owl in her hand. And as important as the owl is to our whole lives, human sexuality classes, I thought that was a really neat connection. And so I suggested through the whole month of wisdom that there's the little nursery rhyme we could use as inserting it in every chapel or every time you get together. Wise old owl lived in an oak. The more he saw, the less he spoke. The less he spoke, the more he heard. Why can't we all be like that wise old bird? I thought that was sweet. So diving into the wisdom sessions, I thought that for the for all ages, there's 3 wisdom books about Old Turtle that would make a really nice wisdom series, using each one through each for all ages, if you have 3 of them that month. That was a suggestion, and I didn't write down every single one of them. I wrote down the very first one, Old Turtle, and put the note that Old Turtle and the Broken Truths, and the other one could be a series. Then moving into preschool, when I wrote a curriculum on my own, it was called Picture Book UU. It was the books, the Henry series, that are based on Henry David Thoreau. This is Henry Hikes to Fitchburg. The one that's the original one, which of course I couldn't find this morning, is Henry Builds a Cabin. But they're bear-shaped. He's a bear-shaped D.B. Johnson. And they formed the beginning, let me put it over here, of that Picture Book UU, because I think they're some of the best ones to have in your RE library, if you are able to have an RE library. And so I suggested the Henry Hikes to, Henry Builds a Cabin as the storybook for preschool on the wisdom of simplicity, because doesn't Thoreau capture that wisdom of simplicity for us in the best way possible? All right. So then, the second thing I wanted to mention for the preschool children is Pam Baxter's book, A Cup of Light, available in the UUA bookstore. And it's the most accessible, quick read to do for a picture book for children on what our chalice means. So I just want to lift that up again so that everyone has a copy. And this is also a book I give to parents with babies or somebody who's new and ask me for a book. I actually used to keep 3 or 4 copies so that I could just hand it to them as a gift. All right. Then we go into simplicity, the session number 1 for elementary school children. So I actually have a sled kite. So all of the times that I've been a director of a camp for one of our either regional assembly or general assembly, I use this kite because it is the best one that I have ever found in my 33 years. So it's pretty plain looking when you get it. Here it is. It's called Color a Sled Kite. And I have the ordering information, and it's packaged in this thing. It's sort of white. You pull it out, and there's a box of crayons. I don't recommend you use those crayons by themselves. They're sort of not as nice, but we use permanent markers because we dealt with elementary school children and middle schools. So you get your string is already wound up, right? It's already connected to the kite. And then this is Tyvek, which is that stuff you can't tear, and it's the like postal envelopes. So it's super tough, and it makes what's called a sled kite shape. So there's your shape. Got the little hole for the extra air to go through. It's got the tail, and when you're flying it, it flies like this. It's so simple, and the idea is you invite the children to color this in their own design. That was so much fun. They really got into making their own graphics, and the other super thing about this is that they fly even in little tiny bits of wind. So you get a satisfying bodily experience because you can finally find a kite that works, that's cool, and you can fly. All right, so that's my sled kite ad. Oh yeah, so the next thing is the 4 parts, the 5 sessions that I came up with, the lenses for wisdom. So the wisdom of simplicity, the wisdom of clowning, the role of the jester in trickster in our lives, the wisdom of our UU sources. We're always looking for something on UU sources. The wisdom of story. So that's the wisdom stories. And the wisdom of our bodies, what our body knows. And so for the elementary school children, I suggest the wisdom of simplicity is for the preschoolers, it's the Henry series. For the children, it's making, it's a story of a kite dragon. And for the clowning, it's The Emperor's New Clothes, which is a wonderfully satisfying, clownish story. For our UU sources, I suggest going, besides naming those 6 sources, I suggest celebrating Pi Day, which is March 14th. As Sam knows, we always like to do science and nature. And there's all kinds of great little, there's a story, circumference, and the story of pi. And then there's making pies and doing some of the equational measuring of circumferences. But I feel like celebrating the source of science and reason is a good way to teach that we are a living tradition, which means it changes. And so we understand that our faith may change down the road. And I think I also mentioned that, for instance, the 6th source wasn't there, and it isn't listed in the Gray Hymnal, by the way, Singing the Living Tradition, because that was published in the early 90s, and 1995 is when we added the 6th source. So all these things about the UU sources. And then I get into the 3rd source of clowning. making newspaper clown hats, and I wanted them to understand a connection. It's Purim and Holi, which is Hindu and Jewish. And rather than say, let's celebrate Holi or Purim, I suggest, what would a UU festival of clowning look like for us? The two videos that I suggest showing show the people in Holi having an absolutely crazy time, and there's a nice one filmed in Jerusalem of what they're doing in Purim. This is a time when they act crazy and they act out this melodrama of the story of Esther. So what would a UU festival of clowning be like? And I encourage you to be just a little bit risk-taking. You know, it's not going to be something you can plan because you want to ask the children what their ideas are. You might want to have some things on hand. I would suggest face paints and balloons, for instance, and maybe some music. So there's a little playlist in there. So just dancing can be a possibility. And I'll tell you a story about myself. I was this UU kid who hated when they'd say, okay, let's dance. Let's do this creative dancing. And even now, liturgical dance makes me cringe a little bit. And yet, when I was doing what we did in Boulder Valley Spirit Jam, the young adult teachers put on a wonderful playlist, you know, Obladi Oblada by the Beatles, some of the old danceable 80s and 90s tunes. And they just said, let's dance. And the kids loved it. And yes, there were a few on the sidelines who were just ready to run out of the room, cringing. And those are the kids that I would invite to make the newspaper hats. You know, something different on the side. And yet there were 30 kids just having a ball and they didn't want to stop. The other place I saw dance was with my co-director at GA Middle School. And I would never have thought that middle schoolers would dance. And so I left this to Matthew. He's a theater and dance major, and he actually choreographed a dance of justice and invited the kids interested to come and dance with him. And he taught them this choreography. And after we played Foursquare the next day, they came back in and they said, can we do that, some more of that choreography? So I'm willing to open my closed little mind to dance, and I hope you will too, as part of a UU Festival of Clowning, to turn what we know upside down. And that's the whole point of the wisdom of clowning. So then in the wisdom of stories, so the wisdom stories, which are so beautiful. I mean, wouldn't it be nice if we could base our whole RE program just on story? I suggest telling, there is no book, the parable of the difference between heaven and hell. And the reason being is, again, how powerful I saw this being acted out. So the difference between heaven and hell is that hell is you go in and there's all these people and their arms are all stiff and they have spoons on the end and they can't reach their mouth and they're starving and they're thirsty, right? They go into the next room, which is heaven, and the people their arms are stiff and they have spoons at the end, and lo and behold, they're feeding each other, and that is heaven. So to illustrate that, I do the actual thing. So here's my spoon. So I just duct tape spoons onto a paint stirrer. And there you go. It's pretty long, and so it's going to really take some feeding. However, if you want to cheat, use just a regular spoon and then tell the kids they can't bend their arms, right? That's this quick and simple, because you still are going to can't reach your mouth, but it's not quite as long as the real one. But this is so cool. They won't forget that session if you give them spoons on paint stirrers and ask them to act it out. Let's see. So the other piece of the month of March is this is it's the month when the Selma Montgomery march happened, the actual protest march, in which 2 white UUs were murdered. James Reeb I knew about pretty much my whole life, because when I served with Reverend Walter Royal Jones, he was actually there, and used to share stories of the men being told to stuff their hats with newspaper, so if they were hit on the head, there might be a chance they wouldn't get a concussion, that kind of thing. And he told me about James Reeb and his murder. I never knew about Viola Liuzzo until, what, 6 years ago? And the Smithsonian just came out with an incredible story about how the reason no one knew about her is that Herbert Hoover instigated a smear campaign against her. And so when her children went to school after their mother was killed down there, she was accused of being a prostitute. She was accused of being a radical communist. They tried to do everything they could to bury her story. And it wasn't until just a few years ago that they found out that there was an FBI informant in the car with the Ku Klux Klan. And that's why they didn't want her murder and that car to be identified. Oh, it's so sad, because the family then dealt with horrible prejudice for the rest of their lives until just recently. And so I want that story to be yet again one of the ones we lift up. And we acknowledge that, yes, these were the 2 white UUs whose story we tell. And there were all these Black people being murdered and lynched. And we buried those stories. But I do want those 2 UU stories to be lifted up. So Viola is given her due. That's about it for me for this overview. Yep, perfect timing. And I'm going to move my spoons here just so I don't knock them off. There we go. And invite you both to share your challenges, your thoughts about this month of wisdom. And Sam, do you want to go first?
Sure, I'll go first. My challenge with the month of wisdom is this is the month that we would typically have our Why Are You service. And unfortunately this year our teens, majority of our teens are MIA. They're working, they have a million extracurricular activities. Some of them are dealing with illness. So it's very quiet. And a couple of our newbies are just not ready to carry a service. They're not there yet. So we're having to, we want to keep a service about youth and have youth voices, and having to balance how do we do that without telling their stories in our voices. And it's an interesting balance, because our youth, our children have a ton of wisdom that adults really need to hear. And how do we tell their stories and tell it appropriately and give those voices justice? So that's my challenge for March right now.
All right, cool. Thanks for sharing. Karina.
Hi.
Hi there. You in the middle of credentials.